Hello there. When a chief executive describes a recently unearthed financial irregularity as a grave concern and admits its discovery represents a bombshell, you know a situation is bad. For the Irish Horseracing Regulatory Board, it seems very bad indeed. Things are seldom boring with the IHRB, nor indeed the BHA, whose new whip rules and sanctions are seen by critics as a complete mess. I could have gone stronger. Frankie Dettori is at the heart of the latest development. We'll be discussing that, and also a second Derby victory for Auguste Rodin, whose Curragh Classic triumph hardly set the world on fire. That's all to come in this latest edition of The Front Page. I am Lee Mottershead, and I'm joined by my colleagues Jonathan Harding, Matt Rennie, and our Ireland editor Richard Forristal. Hi Richie.
Hi Lee.
You've had a busy old few days in Ireland. The news situation there has not been quiet.
No, yeah, you'd like to be concentrating on the build-up to these big races, on the big race themselves, but of course we had this intervention on Thursday which was fairly explosive in nature, shall we say.
Yeah, more of that in a second. Rich's been racing at the Curragh. Matt, you were at Newcastle on Saturday for the plate. Good day there?
Yep, fantastic day as always. The Geordie crowd were in full voice as they were vocal and enjoying the sun up there as well, and a terrific day's action as well. A much deserved result for calling the wind and trainer Richard Hughes.
Yeah, that was smashing. And Jonathan, how's your weekend been?
My weekend, good. I was off Saturday.
Nice.
I'm still trying to, I don't know if I'll fill the readers in on my love of golf, newfound love of golf, but I'm improving very slowly.
Have you got a handicap mark yet?
Not even at that point yet, so that tells you how it went on Saturday. But okay. I was off on Saturday and working yesterday.
Okay, well, Open Championship no doubt in 12 months' time.
Here's hoping.
Before that, much racing chat, and our first subject for racing chat today is the situation with the IHRB. Richie Forristal, can you just give us a précis, if you like, of where things are and what's happened in the last few days?
Yeah, well, it goes back to last Thursday, as we know at this stage. The IHRB was invited before the Public Accounts Committee, its Chief Executive, Darragh O'Loughlin, principally to discuss the controversial exit package of Dennis Egan when he left in 2021 and the 2021 accounts. And during Darragh O'Loughlin's his opening speech, he made an intervention off his own bat, unprompted, that they had uncovered a previously unknown issue in the previous 48 hours that caused him grave concern. They were his own words. And then as the meeting went on and as questions were asked by committee members and so on, we learned that it was a financial irregularity. And then we found out that the previous day, the IHRB's CFO, Donal O'Shea, had gone on leave with immediate effect. We don't know what the nature of that leave is. That in itself was a bit of a curious one. But he's gone on leave and it seems to be indefinite at the moment. There is an investigation now due to be undertaken by Mazars into this, and I guess we're going to learn probably very little between now and then. We were told by Suzanne Eade of HRI when she was asked that it didn't appear to be a criminal issue, and that there didn't appear to be any misappropriation of public funds. And the IHRB have since kind of echoed that there didn't appear to be a misappropriation of public funds, and there doesn't appear to be an issue of personal gain. That's about as much as they've been willing to confirm. So, it's when you have a regulatory body like the IHRB or HRI for that matter, when they've been in there, and I know Suzanne Eade was in there the other day along with Jason Morris of HRI, but it was ultimately the IHRB who were there to answer questions. When you have bodies like that before these committees, whether it's the Agriculture Committee or the PAC, it's not ideal to see them being grilled over integrity and transparency issues when that is ultimately what they are there to implement. And a number of committee members made that observation. We've been here before to some extent with CCTV, with Egan's payment. There were a lot of questions, albeit many of which were unfounded, over the doping protocols at the IHRB, anti-doping protocols and so on. So it's just frustrating that we can't have a little bit more faith in the governance of our regulators and the regulatory body, that they are doing the job that they're meant to be doing and getting on with it in the background. I suppose it's a bit like a referee in a match. If they're doing a good job, you're not hearing much about them. And we're hearing a bit too much about the IHRB in these committees and elsewhere.
Richie, you referenced there that Darragh O'Loughlin had ruled some things out, if you like, to an extent anyway. He spoke about, as you say, what is involved here. It doesn't appear to be the case of someone doing something for personal gain. So he's ruled a lot of things out. Were there any things that, when he was speaking over the weekend, he's done various television interviews, were there any things that he wasn't prepared to rule out?
Well, I think in general he hasn't wanted to comment any further on it. But like, there is a big gaping void left when you make an announcement like he did, and there is ultimately speculation. People want to know, I suppose, what was the nature of the transaction if it wasn't for personal gain, or if it wasn't a misappropriation of public funds. Where was the money taken from or going to? Nobody knows that. I noticed, interestingly, Nick Nuck on Sunday yesterday asked him a very kind of narrowly defined question about the charities that the IHRB, in conjunction with the Turf Club and the IHSC, manage. Like, there's various charities, the Jockeys Emergency Fund, the Jockeys Trust, and so on. And he asked him a very clearly defined question about whether he could assuage any concerns that there was any inappropriate use of those funds, and he declined to offer that assurance in the way he had done in relation to the misappropriation of public funds or personal gain. So that was slightly disconcerting. We don't know if it meant anything, because generally speaking, he hasn't been willing to offer any follow-up answers on this topic. But you would have liked, I suppose, in that instance, when he asked a very narrowly defined question, you would have liked him to be able to say, no, that's not the area. But he didn't, and we don't know if that means anything or not. Time will tell.
Richie, what sort of time scale do we think this story will develop over? I thought Darragh O'Loughlin initially said it would take a while, but there was also some commentary whereby he thought this independent special report might report back sooner than maybe we expected.
Yeah, to be honest, no, I haven't seen him kind of suggest that. There was a suggestion once, so that he's obviously been on a lot of platforms over the last few days, and I haven't seen everything. So if he has suggested that, that's interesting, because the initial suggestion was it might take months, and if it could be dealt with a lot sooner than that, I think it would be much more satisfactory. At the moment, the IHRB doesn't appear to have an operating CFO. I asked them on Friday, what was happening in lieu of his absence at the moment, and they said the existing team were managing the situation, which, I'm sure it'll do a job, but it's probably not ideal. There's a CFO there for a reason. So the sooner the thing is dealt with and addressed, the better for everyone, I think.
One of the things he did say, Rich, again, was when the Dennis Egan situation and his final payoff, if you like, from the IHRB was talked about, Darragh O'Loughlin said it would be wrong to conflate that and this grave concern that he had regarding the accounts. And yet the Dennis Egan story was the one that, in effect, should have been at the heart of this appearance before the committee. A number of things were discussed in relation to Dennis Egan that I think people watching will have watched and listened to with jaws dropping. One of them being that it appears that Dennis Egan, as Chief Executive of Ireland's regulatory body, had no live contract with the organisation. Again, that seems extraordinary.
Incredible. Yeah, absolutely incredible. In 2018, as you'll know, the Turf Club transitioned into the IHRB from a regulatory point of view, and that's a private limited company. And how someone in a CEO position like Dennis Egan could function for a private limited company like that without a contract of employment, it just seems bizarre. Now, if there is one there, they didn't provide it, and maybe that's the point, we don't know. The Comptroller and Auditor General, Seamus McCarthy, said the only contract he was furnished with was from 1997, from Dennis Egan's time as CEO with the Turf Club, which seems absolutely bizarre. And as we know, in relation to Dennis Egan's 2021 remuneration package and so on, they have not provided details on that as requested by the Minister. So that is another point of frustration for the Comptroller and Auditor General. So the whole thing, it's just unbelievable, really. And even, the idea that Dennis Egan needed to be furnished with an extra 58% on top of what he was entitled to under the terms of his contract, or under the terms, I should say, of the redundancy scheme.
Absolutely. Richard, back with you in a second. Jonathan and Matt, this is clearly a huge story in Ireland, but quite rightly, it's the top of the news agenda over here as well. Jonathan, you do a lot of stories with BHA over here and with governing bodies. What's your take on it?
I mean, fairly similar to Richie's, I think, in that you can't have a regulator whose sole objective is to make sure everything is above board, everything is squeaky clean, in a situation whereby we're guessing at wrongdoing, we're guessing at all of these things. You can't have funds that are concerns over funds. You can't have golden handshakes for people leaving a regulator. It should be all completely above board, contractual, written out. Otherwise, people lose faith in the regulator. And when people lose faith in the regulator, they lose faith in the way that the product, which is the racing, is administered. So dealing a lot with these organisations, they're held to a higher standard, let's say, perhaps, than others, and quite rightly so. And it seems like they're potentially, and of course there's a great deal of conjecture here, potentially falling below that at the moment.
And I guess, Matt, as well, there's a danger that for a regulator to carry on its normal functions and for people to have confidence in it carrying on its normal functions while this is going on will be extremely difficult.
It will. And as Richie said, the job of a regulatory board really is to act as a referee for the sports. And if you are a good referee, as we've seen in other sports, football and that, normally they go unnoticed. If they're doing their job well, they go under the radar. But this is just sort of, it's unwanted, and it's very, very serious, because they shouldn't be the ones in the headlines if they're trying to be the referees of the sport. It's similar for the BHA if they're a referee, they're the referee of British racing, and we're finding themselves in the headlines for other different reasons, which we'll come on to in the show. It's really serious, and as Jonathan said, it all needs to be sort of unravelled essentially, because you can't be having these golden handshakes really, and the contract situation is incredibly bizarre in a private company. Yeah. That was the one that shocked me when reading and hearing about the story the most, that there was no contract for the CEO there, who was the head of the regulatory bodies. It's completely bizarre, and it needs to be unearthed. What on earth has gone on? Yeah,
absolutely. Rich, just a couple more bits. Joe Lyons was on Lock on Sunday alongside Darragh O'Loughlin on Sunday. They had an awkward exchange when it became apparent that neither had been introduced to the other before, which took umbrage about. But Joe also said that in his view, he would rather see a situation whereby the IHRB didn't exist and regulation was brought under the control of Horse Racing Ireland. Given what's happened here, and given the areas that you highlighted where the IHRB has already been under scrutiny, is the IHRB's very existence to a degree in peril here?
You could certainly surmise that might be the case. I do think, and I would agree with Darragh O'Loughlin on this, that if it was Darragh said it, or maybe it was Brian Cavan actually afterwards, that there has to be a separation of powers from the authority that, or the entity that is promoting the sport, and the entity that is regulating the sport. The IHRB has a whole lot of problems, and I would like to see it separated from the whole amateur ethos. I think that would be a big step forward. Whether disbanding it necessarily is the road they should be looking at, I don't think necessarily that would be the case, but I do think they need to do it a lot more professionally than they have done. And I would go so far as saying, and this isn't anything new, but like a professional stewarding committee, potentially done remotely, if that's what if that's how it would be made to happen, is something that should be looked at, because hiring amateur stewards, different panels of stewards at every meeting, if you like, and the inconsistency that leads to, and the lack of accountability in some respects, is not a satisfactory situation. Now, I know that's a whole other discussion, but I think, and I must say, I think Darragh O'Loughlin has been handed a great big pile of steaming, here. Yeah. He's only in the job 12 months. And I think he has done reasonably well. There will be criticism of, as Ger Lyons said, his lack of visibility. On the other hand, I can see Gerard's point, right, and I do get why these guys should be seen out and about. I do get that. On the other hand, it's also no harm to have a degree of separation between participants and the body that is regulating the sport. It can become too cosy in certain environments, and I think if it's the case that the regulator is doing its job well and keeping its distance and not getting too cosy with the participants, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. So it would be, so for someone like Ger, obviously that would be a change of culture, if you know what I mean. But it might be the sort of change that we should be starting to get used to. So, disbanding the IHRB, in concept, there'll be a lot of people who would be all for that. I would rather it evolved in a much more professional manner and was separated from the old functions, or the old amateur kind of ethos of it. And stood alone as an entity, and that would include separating it from the likes of the Turf Club and the INHSC. They continue to have this kind of tripartite situation, which is all very vague, and I couldn't even give you the details of how that all works. But it should be a standalone regulatory entity that is funded by HRI and policed and audited, under the auspices of HRI and the Department of Agriculture and so on. And have professional stewards and have it done in a very modern way, because at the moment it is still very backward in some of its functions and so on. So like that, I would have a little bit of sympathy for Darragh Loughlin at this stage. He would have had to put his head above the parapet on Tuesday, Wednesday, and then into Thursday to go and do what he did. I don't think he was obliged to do it necessarily, because this was an issue that seemingly appeared in the early 2022 accounts. And he decided it was the right thing to do. He notified the board, he notified the Controller and Auditor General, he notified the department, he notified HRI. He flagged, this is a problem, we're going to deal with it. So I have heard suggestions over the weekend that maybe that wasn't necessary, and I can imagine he encountered a lot of resistance to go ahead and do what he did. So I would have some admiration for him going ahead and doing it anyway, because this is the kind of thing that we need to be dealt with and lanced on the spot, as it were, and fronted up about. So I would be willing to leave the jury out on Darragh for the moment. I've had very little to do with him myself. I've just watched him in action. I spoke to him briefly yesterday. I spoke to him once previously. So I've had very little to do with him. But I think his appointment as someone outside the sport, it can go one or two ways. And you can see how someone in his position gets an awful lot of flack from people within the industry. But they've taken a chance on it. And I would suggest in the long term, it might be for the better.
Richie, excellent. Thank you very much indeed. Have a quick rest, because you've needed again soon. Before we go into story 2, I want to advise you of an excellent offer for the Racing Post Members Club. Welcome back to the front page, and we're one story down, two to go. Before we start on story 2, just a reminder, if you're watching on YouTube, we would love it if you'd like, comment, share and subscribe. Matt Rennie, you're a big liker, commenter, sharer and subscriber, aren't you?
All the time with the Racing Post best products.
Absolutely, and you're also all over the latest situation regarding another ongoing story in British racing, the whip.
Yep, so it seems like it's the fire which no one can seem to put out really, and keeps smouldering in the background until really blowing up in people's faces. And this time it's Frankie Dettori, the flat racing's biggest name in the saddle. He's been given an 8-day ban for his ride on Inspiral in the Queen Anne Stakes at Royal Ascot, and it turned out he went one whip over the limit of 6. and we found this out in the Whip Committee recommendations last Tuesday. The big news about this, though, is that it rules him out of the July Festival at Newmarket in a couple of weeks' time. And obviously, very famously, the July Cup is the only Group 1 in Britain that Frankie has yet to win, and presumably won't win if he's going to retire at the end of the season. And of course, it caused, as the whip does, it caused partisan lines on one side for, one side against. And we had the BHA speaking to us afterwards. Brant Dunshay said, the chief regulatory officer of the BHA, said that the new whip rules, it was evidence the new whip rules and the committee regime was working as intended. And it's at the heart of the recommendation in terms of ensuring consistency. Where the debate comes for this one is, this one happened a week ago, a week before the Whip Committee recommendations came out, and ultimately the vibes that we were getting was it wasn't picked up on until there was a social media tweet from a fellow weighing room colleague highlighting the fact that Frankie might have used his whip 7 times in the final 2 furlongs on In Spiral, and then was picked up in the end. Now,
Brant Dunshay has said, has he, that the two things aren't connected, that it would have been picked up anyway.
Yeah, he said that it would have been picked up anyway. It was just that on the first day they were incredibly busy and they were going to go and look at it. Also, again, some big riders were caught out at Ascot with these whip rules. Asheen Murphy is also out of the July meeting where he might have ridden the favourite Shaquille. Obviously, they teamed up to win the Commonwealth Cup with each other, and Daniel Muscat is also out as well. So it's ignited the debate again about the whip rules, and we had a brilliant column from Richie last week on it. Again, criticising the whip rules, and Chris Cook obviously did another BHA one, which we'll touch on. But it's really stoked the fires of debate again on it.
Yeah, I want to give Richie still a second to rest. He said a lot in the first half.
He has a few thoughts on the whip.
He has, yeah. Hold your fire for a second, Richie. Jonathan, obviously, it's a big story in itself that Frankie Dettori can't ride at the July Festival. We knew the July Cup was the one British Group 1 he was desperate to win. But I guess the wider story is where we are with the whip. The PGA is in a state of evolution at the moment. It hasn't got a full-time permanent chief executive. Dale Gibson is acting as acting chief executive. But we know there are issues with the PGA that perhaps have led us to this situation. The BHA has made clear that it is very happy with how things are and that the system is working. Is the system working?
Well, the BHA's sort of backed itself into a corner. I mean, I've been reasonably consistent in that I felt that it was worth looking at the whip rules. I thought that as a project it was well intentioned, and whether it was completely necessary is a matter of debate still, but I think it was worth having a look at them, seeing if they could be improved. They've obviously laid out these rules, but you now have a situation whereby the punishments don't seem to fit the crime. And for a project that was essentially designed to improve the optics of the sport for the next generation of fans or whatever it was, it's not a particularly good look when you have 2 big riders in Dettori and Asheen Murphy missing racing, and because it suggests fairly extreme wrongdoing when actually it's essentially a minor sporting rule breach. Now the BHA can't really, they would say the bans are relative to this idea that we want them to be a deterrent, so they have to carry reasonable bans in order to stop jockeys doing it. I understand that point, but when you have these massive doubling up if they're in better races and totting up bans and people basically missing out on being able to work for a month, if not longer, as we've had in recent weeks, it's hard to argue that they're working as effectively or as efficiently as they can, because the feeling in the weighing room from conversations I've had, and you might say, a little bit late now the rules have been brought in to be having these conversations, but the feeling is that they are just completely out of kilter. The punishment doesn't fit the crime, and people are essentially being massively penalised for rules and for a change in the rules that many people didn't even want in the first place. So I can kind of sympathise with both sides on this. I haven't really answered your question about whether they're working. I don't think it's a good look at the moment. I don't think it's working for jockeys at the moment. That's clear by it's not just inexperienced jockeys picking up these bans, so it's not the jockeys aren't adapting quite as the BHA had hoped they would. And the BHA just sort of relentlessly sticking by the rules and saying we think their working is perhaps a little bit counterintuitive. I'd like to see them evolve again, the rules.
Which is entirely possible, I think. Before we go to Richard Forristal, I think that there is talk of a review coming up soon. In fact, there will be a review coming up soon where you won't be at all surprised if there are developments. Richie, Jonathan there saying that he can see both sides of this argument. It'd be fair to say, wouldn't it, that you are very much on one side of the argument?
Yeah, I had to bite my tongue there. I didn't want to interject, Jonathan, but I just think it's scandalous, absolutely scandalous, the way they're treating jockeys here. Just for a starter, were you at Royal Ascot, Lee? You were?
I was, yeah.
Did you enjoy it?
I did.
Yeah.
You can ask
the two lads there. Jonathan, Matt, were you there?
No, I wasn't there, but watched it on telly.
Watched on telly. Good week?
Yeah, it's very good, very good. And even I was sitting with people that don't really watch horse racing that much, and they most certainly didn't pick up on Frankie Dettori's or Ashley Murphy's indiscretions.
Yeah.
It was an absolutely outstanding week of racing with close finishes, international aspects, the whole kit and caboodle were in there. There was no uproar at the track. There was a couple of 100,000 people there over the course of the week. I don't know what the final figure was. And there was no uproar, as far as I'm aware, certainly, over the use of the whip. There was no uproar online, on news bulletins, on any printer or digital websites. It's been caused by the sport itself, and it's completely unnecessary, and it's wrong that it's the jockeys that are being singled out here, because they are doing enough to try and win a race, to do the best they can for themselves and their trainers and their owners, and they are being absolutely filleted a week after the event, when we've all gone home with our bellies full of a great week's racing, and they are getting sanctioned a week afterwards, when the broader media's eyes have moved on elsewhere and there's no more interest from them, and they're getting absolutely filleted. There was 77 days of bans handed out last week, 12 separate bans. You had James McDonald, an international rider, getting 14 days for going 2 strikes over in the heat of the moment in a Group 1 sprint. Frankie, as you outlined, got 8 days, and Oisin Murphy got 8 days for a superb race between Valiant King and Desert Hero. I think there was only a head in that, and nobody was offended by what happened. And these guys, Oisin Murphy and Frankie can afford it. Missing one July meeting at Newmarket isn't going to put them up or down. But the rest of the lads who are getting filleted on a weekly basis by these sanctions, they cannot afford it. They're putting their lives and limb on the line for our entertainment on a daily basis, and they do not deserve this. Now, you could say I would be sympathetic to their plight because I'm a former rider and so on, and I can understand why you could take that view that I may be overly sympathetic to them. But that gives me an insight too, I suppose, into what their existence is like. They're up and down the road on a daily basis, starving themselves to be able to do the weights. They take unbelievable physical punishment. It's unbelievably physically demanding. And when you're trying to make decisions in a 6 furlong Group 1 sprint, you're trying to see what's happening around you. You're trying to measure your race. You're trying to factor in an awful lot, and to be expected to hit the nail on the head every time with the counting of a whip is unbelievable. It's unrealistic, is what I should say. It's not a fair expectation. The whole thing has just been allowed to spiral out of control. I think they've been obviously very weakly advised and led by the PJA. I don't think they've been strong enough at all.
Richie, just on that one, Richie, just on that point there, I know a big issue among within the PJ was the fact that they were angry, some of the PJ's leaders and jockeys who represented the PJ on the whip review committee, that jockeys themselves weren't engaged enough during that process, and that the people who were representing jockeys couldn't get the jockeys to take an interest. Now, you were a jockey. Does that ring true?
To be honest, not really, because I certainly sat in on PJA meetings when I was there, and there was always the opportunity to speak up. And the other thing about it is, Lee, like when I was riding, there was a lot of big characters. There was a lot of big characters: Richard Dunwoody, AP McCoy, Norma Williamson. You know, there was a lot of big characters around at the time, and maybe the weigh room is lacking some of them at the moment. You just don't, you just maybe don't see the same degree of personalities who are willing to first of all see what needs to be done and then speak up on it and act on it. That is a possibility. But like it's just such a pity that it's got to this point. And it's so arbitrary. Like they put a number of 6 on it for the flat. Like improper use of the whip is improper use of the whip. 6 is wrong if the horse is going backwards, and the horse isn't responding. 6 is wrong if 2 or 3 of them are when the horse is clear and winning the race. But 7 or 8 might not be wrong in a close finish when you've got a horse that's responding and going forward. So it's infantile was the word I used in relation to the number they decided to put on it. And I just don't know how you can police it with any discretion or with any common sense when they have decided to put a number on it. They expect these guys to go out and put on a show for us, and they just turn around then a week later when all the focus has gone away and they sanction them with these big swinging bans. It's wrong. It's fundamentally absolutely wrong. And the BHA and whoever decided to implement them can say what they like about how effective they are. It's wrong. It's not working, and I think it's an absolute scandal.
Does that therefore mean that you regret the changes that are also happening now in Ireland, aren't they? The penalty, the rules are being beefed up there. It seems as though the trajectory across most major racing nations is going in the same direction, Ireland included.
Yeah, but sure, it's a very Irish thing, I'm afraid, to ape what happens elsewhere, especially in Britain. If Britain coughs, we catch a cold. So I just don't think numbers is the way forward on this. And I do suspect, and this is a personal suspicion and no one's going to ever verify it, but I do suspect there's a fairly sinister agenda there to ultimately do away with the whip, which I think is a dangerous road to go down. I've said it before. If you go to any riding school on a Saturday morning, Lee, the event won't happen without a stick. Not because they're flogging ponies and stuff. It's because you need to use it to make the pony pay attention, give them a slap on the shoulder, to make them go forward. It's the same with horse racing. The whip is needed as an aid. It's not any more than that. But if you don't have it, there is a safety aspect, but there's also the encouragement aspect, because a lot of horses will need it to tune in and to cop on and to give as much as they can. That's all you're asking for. They feel it, it doesn't hurt them. There is a massive difference. And that has been lost in this argument. It's foam padded. As I always say, if it's used correctly and the horse is given time to respond and the horse is struck with it in the correct place, it is not a welfare issue. But there is an agenda, in my opinion, to get rid of it over the course of the next few years. And this is all part of it. They've been picking away at it for a decade now, and that's where it'll end up. And if that's what ultimately what happens, then just see what happens next, because they're trying to placate. And Julia Harrington said this when this came up, but they were basically trying to placate a bunch of people who had no interest in racing and thought it was cruel. That's the kind of people you're trying to placate. So if the whip goes, these people aren't going to go away. It will be jump racing next, and so on and so forth.
We should just say BHA would have an opposite position. They said they weren't trying to get away with the whip. Just to I guess
Absolutely.
put the opposite point of the. Richard, I'm going to come back to you a second because I want to ask all three of you a question here on another matter in which the BHA became involved last week. Matt, you referenced that we had this story linked to a Sadner, so a horse who had been wildly impressive on his debut at Ripon, was then one of the leading contenders for the Coventry Stakes, drifted in the betting in the days leading up to the Coventry, was also entered the Norfolk Stakes, then ran in the Coventry, finished 9th, subsequent to which the horse's owner has removed a Sadner and his other horses with George Bowie from the yard of George Bowie, and then it became apparent when George Bowie was speaking last week that in the days leading up to the Coventry Stakes, the horse had given an indication that there might be a problem. George Bowie kept the BHA fully involved of the horse's veterinary situation leading up to the race, and the horse then did run in the race, ran the race completely uninjured. Subsequent to that, Chris Cook wrote a column in which he argued the BHA should have made punters aware that there was a potential issue with a Sadner. the BHA has said that it does not see that is its role to update punters on an issue that the trainer has with the horse, although again Brant Dunshea in one media interview last week did say he could see the opposite point of view and that maybe punters should be kept informed as they would be in some other jurisdictions. I want to ask all three of the same question. Do you think that George Bowie should have kept punters informed last week of what was going on, and should the regulator have kept punters informed?
I think it's such a difficult one because it's a subjective matter, isn't it? Because George would have looked at it and gone, he has got a cut on his shoulder, we've gone to the BHA, but he seems fine, he's not lame at any point, is what George Bowie said to the BHA. I think from a punting perspective though, you would want to know that before a race. And Sadner was weak in the market before the Coventry Stakes as well. I wonder if the BHA could do something similar to what they do with jockeys that are injured, and they have a scale of green, amber, red if you're medically suspended. Maybe we could do it in a sense of, there could be a section where you'd put in a Sadner, it might come up with his name, a Sadner trainer has informed us he had a cut on his shoulder, but he's not lame, something like that. On this other side, then you might be getting into issues where you're quizzing trainers consistently on the horses who might just have, like a little niggle. Footballers sometimes cramp up before or during a game, but then they're physically okay to continue afterwards. Again, it's just a sort of a link to a different sport there. But then trainers would be under undue pressure from a lot of people to inform them and keep it informed when they might not think it's something so minor that will be gone within hours, maybe even days. However, it seems like the way forward is openness and transparency, and this seems to have been, according to the owner, it seems to have been lost in translation. And I think if you're playing a safe game, be open and transparent for everyone's sake. I think a nation that does it quite well and really well is Australia. Yeah. I think we had Coolangatta, didn't we? She didn't gallop well before coming over to Royal Ascot, and I know they were filming the gallops and that, but Kieran Maher and David Hughes was straight away saying, we're not pleased with this, we're going to we'll think about this, but they were right straight away out there. And I think that's probably the way forward. It needs a bit of cooperation from everyone's side in that sense to avoid it's an unwanted saga, this. It's a bit messy for a horse that essentially flopped in a Coventry and was a big talking point beforehand as well.
Yes. Jonathan, same question. Should Bowie have said something? Should the BHA have said something to the public?
I mean, in an ideal world, I think trainers would be issuing fairly regular updates. If there's we've had it with Nicky Henderson and Altior and the like, haven't we? Done with, will he, won't he run? What's the condition of the horse? All the rest of it. I think you just have to be. You want to be issuing updates, I think, and when you're declaring a horse, there should be something in there that, that you're essentially signing off on their well-being when you declare a horse or when you enter a horse. So whether they would issue an update accordingly to go along with that, I don't think it's. I can see the argument for the BHA getting involved, but you're opening up a huge amount of work for them to do then. I think really trainers should be the ones who are giving out these updates on horses. If there's a significant runner with a significant setback, then I can see why it's in everyone's interest to just be open about it.
Okay.
Social media is and can still be the crucial key to all of this. It's such easy to put the information out there. A lot of trainers are brilliant, and especially the younger up-and-coming trainers are brilliant in using social media, not just for colourful pieces and stuff, but for notable information as well. And that could be really key just for immediate minor information, and maybe taking a look at the likes of Twitter when hopefully it returns to normality, and whenever it may be, Facebook, Instagram can be a real sort of crucial theme in helping get that information out there into the public domain. Okay.
Richie, it seems to me, high-profile horse, high-profile race. Trainer had a concern with the horse. I think the trainer should have said something. I think once the BHA knew, the BHA should have said something, and it should be general. If the trainer tells the BHA something like that, the BHA can make that knowledge public as it would in other jurisdictions. What's your take on it?
Yeah, it's a tricky one, Lee, because it's a whole cultural thing, really, and it's a judgment call at the moment on the part of the trainer. The idea that they would notify the BHA and the BHA would notify the public of concerns. As the lads say, in an ideal world, that would make a whole lot of sense. But where do you draw the line, and what, in terms of concerns and in terms of what's notified to the public? George Boy obviously knew there was an issue with the horse. The horse had a cut. He was on his shoulder. He was never lame. He didn't feel it was going to impact the horse's performance at all. But he obviously wanted to let the BHA know, because the BHA were going to be inspecting the horse come the day of the race. So he didn't want it to just land on them and say, "What's this?" And he's given them some advance notice of it to put them in the picture. But it's at the moment, in the environment we have and the culture we have, it's unrealistic to expect trainers to notify the BHA or the public of every little thing. Now, some of them, as the lads have said, are better at doing it than others. They will just say, "Look, there's an issue here. We wanted to let you know." And sometimes, it works both ways, doesn't it? If the horse goes and wins, you get accused of trying to put people away and get a bigger price. And if it doesn't, if it runs poorly, then there's an easy opportunity there to blame that. If you wanted to go down that road, you would really need a proper database, a full database that on a daily basis a trainer can update any relevant information and file it into that. That costs a lot of money and a lot of labour, and we're a million miles from that in Britain and Ireland at the moment. Maybe in other jurisdictions they have something like that, maybe in your Hong Kongs and so on. I don't know. But that is what you would need, because otherwise it becomes a judgment call, and who's to say who's right or wrong. You could have a fairly significant issue, but you could back yourself to get the horse there in time, and the horse could win. Like, by right, maybe you should have informed the public or the BHA about that, but the horse won, it didn't impact its performance, so why should you? As I say, a whole cultural thing. It's not, it's very hard to be hard on George Boy, because he felt the horse was fine all along and he was happy that it was going to run, but it was a preemptory kind of notice that he decided to give the BHA because he knew they'd be looking at the horse. So I wouldn't be too. If you want to go down this road, the whole lot in together, every horse in there, daily updates, that are filed in there of any concern. So we're a long way from that, I'd say.
We're a very short way though from the Irish Derby, which we had on Sunday. Another classic there for Auguste Rodin. We'll talk about that in a second. But before we do, news of some exciting free bets for you. Welcome back to part 3 of the front page. It was the Irish Derby on Sunday, and Jonathan Harding, it was yet another Irish Derby win for Aidan O'Brien.
Yes, and the first man to reach 100 European Classics, which is unsurprising. It's slightly scary to think about how many he might reach if he continues at the pace he's going at the moment. Look, we've run out of superlatives for Aidan O'Brien, so that was fantastic. Auguste Rodin, we're slightly running out of superlatives for him as well after Epsom, but this was a more laboured performance. It's easy to pick holes in these things, isn't it? But I was still reasonably impressed, given it wasn't the best pace to aim at. There was a few other factors and he still won reasonably well. Big question now is where he goes next when he steps up against the older horses. It'll be really interesting to see how he measures up, but he hasn't put a foot wrong, and it was another really good, if not slightly more laboured performance yesterday.
Yeah, yesterday.
Losing my days now.
Yeah, it was yesterday. Matt used for the Pitman's Derby on Saturday. Great win for Calling the Wind and Richard Hughes. Their biggest wins together. But in the even bigger derby, the Irish Derby on Sunday, what was your take on Auguste Rodin?
I thought it was okay. We've seen before with horses that have won at Epsom and won the Epsom Derby that maybe it's taken a little bit out of them more than we thought. Camelot won the Irish Derby, very workmanlike. I mean, that was in bottomless ground in 2012, but he won that in workmanlike sort of fashion as well. I think Auguste Rodin's a bit of a horse that just does enough and does save himself a bit more. So I don't think we've got the real gauge of how good he is yet. And some of the very best horses only won by doing just enough. See the Stars, for example. And I'm not saying Auguste Rodin's in the See the Stars category just yet, not by a long way, because the Irish Derby, we've beaten a rank outside a stablemate. It does leave more questions possibly than answers, and it's the next race where there's going to be the big questions answered, whether it be the King George at Ascot or the Juddmonte International. I know they might want to get a 1 mile 2 furlong Group 1 on their CV for stallion purposes. Hopefully it's the King George, because that's already shaping up to be an absolutely terrific race, and even though I think Auguste Rodin's a good horse, I think he might possibly just be found out by the older horses there, as our esteemed colleague Chris Cook said in the Cook Review in today's paper.
Yeah, Richie, if you were looking towards a King George or a Juddmonte International or an Irish Champion Stakes or an Arc with Auguste Rodin, and you're taking on the big older boys, would you be going there with confidence?
Sure. You couldn't after yesterday. He was very laboured, as the lads have already articulated. But I think he's probably better than that. I'm not sure, and this is just me speculating. I'm not sure the King George would be where I'd expect him to turn up. He's had a fairly hard race. He's after coming off the Derby and the Newmarket. You know, I know he did it with Galileo, but more recently, I'm not sure those Derby winners go on to the King George much for it. I know Australia didn't. I think he waited for the Juddmonte at York. I wouldn't be surprised if he got a slight break and went for something like the Juddmonte and then onto the Irish Champion Stakes. He made a lot of hard work of it yesterday, but they went no gallop. There was a strong wind, and that seemed to be a factor of play. And you could see with Shamey on the runner-up Adelaide, he almost looked at times as if he was wondering was he ever going to go by him, but he went by him in the end. He got the job done. He's still a very good horse. You know, we won't be judging him on the basis of that just yet. Let's see what happens later in the summer and the autumn. And
one last question, Richie. There's been a lot of soul-searching about the Irish Derby in recent years. Was yesterday's race a positive development for the contest, or do you still feel there are issues that need to be resolved with the Irish Derby?
Yeah, there are issues that need to be resolved. I think they probably missed the boat, really, in that France got the 10 furlong race. They were the ones who made that decision to go to 10 furlongs. They got the good horse yesterday. They got Auguste Rodin, that was the one they want. But they don't tend to get everything. So they don't tend to get a good horse, international challengers, depth to the challenge. Yesterday you had 7 or 8 O'Brien horses, 5 from Ballydoyle. We're not getting the variety consistently. Obviously we've had a couple of English winners the last couple of years, but then you don't have the depth to the race, as I say. It's very hard for the Irish Derby at the moment to have everything. And, we're judging it against the Irish Derbies of the past, when it was one of the defining European classics. It's not anymore. And whether going to 10 furlongs is the solution or not, I don't know. As I say, the French were quick off the mark there, and they got that call right. And we don't see their horses turning up here anymore. So what they do with it, I'm not sure. It's a big discussion because it's not right at the moment. It's just not consistently where we'd want it to be. I'm sure they'll review it and look over it and see if there's another way. They've tried incentives in the past, and nothing has really. There is no silver bullet, I suppose, put it that way. But it just needs more. It's not getting enough of the relevant factors every year for it to be deemed a success at the moment.
No, absolutely not. Although I'm not sure everyone would be keen to see it go to Monaco. Alan Sweetman had a very strong argument for it in his column last week. But obviously there are plenty of people who think that Derby should always be over 1.5 miles. A Curragh trip is always well worth doing, however. Fabulous racecourse, as is Santa Anita. How would you like a free holiday to the home of this year's Breeders' Cup? Here's how you can get one, potentially. Okay, time now to wrap up this week's programme. We've had very strong stories in relation to the Irish Derby, another classic for Aidan O'Brien, first Irish Derby for Ryan Moore, to the latest situation with regards the whip and Frankie Dettori's ban, and of course the IHRB Furore saga. Call it what you will, and we'll call it the winning story. I think quite obviously, Richie Forristal, it has to be the winning story this week. Congratulations.
I'm not sure if I meant to say thanks there, Lee, but cheers.
Well, I'd have liked some more reaction than you gave me, but I'll settle for anything. I will say...
I'm not taking any credit for the story, I just wrote it.
Well, you did it beautifully, and you probably deserve an overtime payment too for your contribution on this week's show. So thank you to Richie, thank you to Jonathan, thank you to Matt, thank you for watching. We'll be back again next week, and until then, bye-bye.